So the dialogue continues with this second definition, and Socrates kind of brings it back to shape, and he says, what what would you give as a definition for shape?
Mm.
And it gets kind of interesting here, because Meno, there's three different definitions of shape that are given here, and there's a difference in the way Socrates, in the definition that Socrates prefers and the definition that Meno prefers. Meno prefers a more clever sounding definition.
Right.
And Socrates prefers the more simple definition. So Meno prefers the one that makes him sound like he's really well educated, really well learned, and smarter than everybody else. And Socrates prefers the definition that anybody can understand, and he can then move on from a discussion and have a discussion about that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what you really kind of want with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes sense to keep, especially when it comes down to definitions, everything as simple as possible.
Exactly.
As long as it's also correct.
Yeah.
I know all definitions are technically valid, but if you want to have a conversation about, say, atheism, you don't want to use, as I've jokingly said, a cheese sandwich is an atheist, you know.
I mean, it's technically correct. It's not
But
very good.
That's just an example, though, Dave. That's an example. That's not what atheism actually is.
No. So, what happens here is Socrates tries to get Meno to give him a definition of shape. And Meno kind of argues, well, no, you give me the definition. I wanted a discussion about virtue. You're talking about shapes now. What's all this about? You tell me the definition of shape. And Socrates says, well, if I give you this definition, will you then talk to me about virtue? And Meno agrees.
Yeah.
So,
well, interestingly, though, I mean, this is something that I find frustrates others in conversations that I'm having with them, where I say, okay, let's put a pin in this just for a second. Let's try and address it through another medium. If we were to think about it this way, so for example, talking about defining things purely by what we lack, you know, is baldness just a lack of hair? Well, it's not, because someone can shave their head and they're not technically bald, they're a skinhead. Baldness is actually something that comes due to usually having like too much testosterone or too much stress, basically a hormonal imbalance of some kind, or just old age, so the hair's getting thinner. There's always something else to what makes someone actually bald versus someone who's decided to shave their head. So you wouldn't necessarily refer to someone who's bald as a skinhead and vice versa. I know in some countries that there might not necessarily be that separation, but at least within the English language, that's how it's done. And there are not many things described based purely on what they lack, especially not just one thing that they lack. There's always a multiple of things that they lack to describe that.
yeah, usually our definitions give rise to some property or state of affairs rather than a lack of state of affairs, apart from broke.
Yeah. Yeah.
That defines a lack of money, but it doesn't just define a lack of money. It also defines an economic condition.
Yes, where your outgoings are probably at a point where they're higher than your income, or at least you've got yourself into a situation where your income and outcome's exactly the same, and what you've got left over at it is the end is nothing.
Yeah,
Example.
exactly.
Yeah. So again, even then, even though the simple bit is someone who doesn't have enough money, there you go, I've qualified it by saying enough money, because as you mentioned there, it's the economic state around everything that's involved. You wouldn't necessarily say a child was broke, because a child's finances are based on the parents' finances.
Exactly. The child lacks money, like most people say, somebody who's broke lacks money, but you wouldn't call a child broke.
It's a different position that they've got. So
yeah,
again, there is more than just a lack of money, more than just one thing that they lack.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I kind of wish people thought about that more when it comes to atheism. It's more than just the psychological state. It's a stance, or can be a stance on the question: does God exist?
Yeah. I think we're preaching to the choir right now, though.
Oh yeah, obviously.